In an unexpected turn of events that no one could have predicted, Corey Harrison, the son of Rick Harrison, famous for the show Pawn Stars, made a life-changing decision to cut all ties with his father. But the reason behind this sudden move is linked to an unimaginable discovery, a secret buried beneath the very roof of the Harrison family home. This discovery has shaken the foundation of the father-son relationship and completely changed the public's perception of Rick Harrison's empire. The Pawn Stars empire is synonymous with the name Rick Harrison, the head of the world-famous pawn shop. But the truth behind the fame reveals an entirely different story. Want to know the truth behind it all? Don't forget to leave a comment with the number 1 if you sympathize with Rick Harrison, or 0 if you have a different opinion. Like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next, where we'll reveal all the secrets in this story. He built a legacy that reached millions through his reality TV show, but behind the bustling family business's surface lies a much darker reality simmering beneath. An empire built on valuable antiques and surprising treasures, concealed secrets right on the land that it has stood on for years. Corey Harrison, Rick's son, had witnessed his father's rising fame and wealth, while always nurturing a sense of unease that something was wrong. He had no idea that his father's hidden past would soon be revealed in ways he could never have imagined. It all started with a simple curiosity, a lingering suspicion that began to grow in Corey's mind when he was young. Corey had always admired his father's ability to turn a good deal into a fortune. The pawn shop was a family business, and Rick was the undisputed king of deals. But as Corey grew older and became more involved in the business, he began noticing the oddities. Small things that seemed insignificant, but were enough to make him question the true nature of the Harrison family legacy. However, Corey did not know that his suspicions would lead him down a path that would completely shatter everything he thought he knew about his father. The estate, once a symbol of his father's success, a grand estate where the Harrison family lived lavishly, would become the setting for a chilling discovery. This discovery not only changed Corey's life, but also uncovered a web of corruption, manipulation, and betrayal. Not long before, Corey found himself entangled in a conspiracy far beyond the pawn shop. The decision to sever ties with his father and expose the truth was not one Corey took lightly. For many years, Rick was not just a father to him, but a mentor, a guide, and the person who taught him everything about the family business. But there was a line Corey could no longer ignore. That line was crossed the day he stumbled upon the hidden files beneath his father's estate. At first, it was just a routine inspection. Corey had recently inherited part of the family estate, and as part of her new responsibilities, she decided to take a closer look at the foundations of the family mansion. But she had no idea that she would find hundreds of files carefully hidden within the walls of the house. The pages, yellowed with age, were filled with detailed notes containing the names of women and children, their lives reduced to a string of numbers, dates, locations, and abandoned houses across the country. As Corey flipped through the documents, a deep sense of unease washed over her. The files contained disturbing details showing a well-organized human trafficking ring. The pawn shop, once thought of as a place for ancient coins and classic furniture, was now revealed to be a place hiding far darker activities. Rick Harrison, The man who had built an empire on deals was now accused of being linked to something far darker than anything Corey had ever known or could have imagined. Her father's empire was not just made up of valuable antiques, but something far more terrifying. Corey's hands trembled as she went through the documents, each page seeming to tell the story of a victim, each page linked to a time and place. But the worst part was that these records had been carefully concealed, kept far from prying eyes. They were not just a few pages, but an entire web of documents spanning years, with her father's fingerprints all over them. This discovery hit Corey like a freight train. Her world, her understanding of her family, was suddenly called into question. The man she had admired her whole life was now implicated in a global human trafficking operation. How could this be? How could her father, Rick Harrison, the face of a family-friendly TV show, the man who made a fortune negotiating prices with overly eager salespeople, be involved in such a heinous crime? Corey's thoughts spun out of control. She needed answers, but more than that, she knew she had to act. She could not let her father's actions go unpunished. The man she called father for all these years was no longer the person she trusted. But what could Corey do with this damning evidence? How could she live knowing that the man who had shaped her life was now the one who had betrayed everything they stood for? Soon after, Corey made up her mind. The evidence was too clear to ignore, too dangerous to remain silent. And so, in an act that would forever change her life, Corey Harrison went to the FBI. The initial conversation with the authorities was tense, filled with doubt and disbelief. Could Rick Harrison, the proud owner of the gold and silver pawn shop, really be involved in human trafficking? The idea seemed absurd, incompatible with the image of Rick they had seen on television. But the evidence was undeniable, and as the FBI delved deeper into the investigation, they realized the full extent of the case. They discovered that not only the files Corey found, but also a network spanning across continents, involving powerful figures and secret operations that had been happening for years. When the FBI began their investigation, they uncovered that Rick's involvement was not limited to hiding files beneath his estate. The pawn shop had been used as a front for human trafficking, a means to launder money and move victims across state lines. This revelation changed the public's perception of Rick Harrison and the entire Pawn Stars series. Meanwhile, Corey found herself at the center of a media storm. Her decision to expose her father's involvement in a criminal enterprise shocked the public. How could she betray her father like this? How could she destroy everything Rick had worked so hard to build? But for Corey, this decision was never about loyalty. Her father always spoke about doing the right thing, about standing up for the victims whose lives were destroyed by the man she once trusted. The public's reaction was mixed. Some saw Corey as a hero, someone willing to stand up for justice no matter the cost, while others saw her as a traitor, a person who turned her back on her family for a scandalous story. As Corey found herself in the eye of this storm, she couldn't help but reflect on the life she had lived for so many years. Rick Harrison's son lived in the shadow of the family business, but now he was no longer just the heir to the pawn shop. He was a whistleblower, someone who had exposed the dark side of the world he once knew, and in doing so, tore his family apart in front of the world. Corey knew the consequences of her actions would be immense. Her relationship with her father had been irreparably damaged, and she would never look at Rick the same way again. But what haunted her more than anything was the realization that this was only the beginning. There were still so many things to uncover, so many victims to save, and the investigation was far from over. The real question now was, what would happen to the Harrison legacy when all of Rick's actions were revealed? The truth was still out there, buried beneath the estate, waiting to be uncovered. But Corey knew her journey had only just begun. The road ahead was long and uncertain, full of challenges and betrayal. But one thing was clear. She had decided to fight for what was hers. Whatever happens next, he is ready to face it. It was a quiet night, when Corey Harrison's world was about to turn upside down. The mansion had always been a comfort for the Harrison family. It was not only a residence, but also a symbol of success, the wealth they had worked so hard for, and their fame as reality TV stars. The house had become a symbol of luxury and stability, but for Corey, it was also where questions about the empire began to arise. Strange details began to surface, and the feeling of unease about his father's empire started to take root. Corey had spent more time at the mansion in recent months. His life had taken an unexpected turn after his involvement in the pawn business became more complicated. As Rick's son, Corey had always been the center of attention, but the pressure of running the family business started to weigh on him. At 35, Corey had long been considered the clear heir, a clear part of the Harrison family legacy. However, he began to question all of it. The pawn shop, the TV show, and the wealth that came with it. None of that satisfied him as it once did. He had seen the price his father had paid over the years. Rick had been consumed by the business, and Corey began to see a side of him he had never understood before. It was not just the constant deals or the cameras. It was something deeper, something Corey couldn't fully express. One night, while going through old documents in the mansion's library, Corey discovered something that didn't belong there. He had been tasked with sorting through some of his father's old files, remnants from his early business days, before cameras and fame. In the clutter, Corey found a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, a space he had never noticed before. At first, he thought it might have been a mistake, a relic from the past that had simply been forgotten. But when he opened the compartment, he found a stack of files neatly organized in manila folders. Corey's curiosity won out, and he began to go through the documents. They were dated, some from many years ago, others more recent. The more he read, the more uneasy he became. Names, dates, locations, everything seemed off. At first glance, these documents didn't look like they belonged in a mansion like this. They had nothing to do with antiques or pawn deals, and they didn't seem related to the legitimate business Rick had built over time. Over the years, no, this was something entirely different. The names in the files were not those of people wanting to sell their antique furniture or collectibles. They were victims. Corey was truly shocked when she realized this. It was a list of individuals, their names and personal information carefully documented. But they were not just names. These documents included addresses, dates, and detailed notes about each individual. Some notes were abbreviated, but others described specific locations where the victims were taken. Some addresses were familiar, some Corey recognized from her childhood, while others were much more frightening. The files seemed to span multiple states, even countries. Corey's hands began to tremble as she flipped through each file, the truth sinking in, and the weight of this discovery crushed her. What had her father been involved in? Could this be a sick joke? Could Rick really be involved in something so filthy? Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of the pile of documents in front of her, unable to deny that what she had stumbled upon was far darker than anything she had ever imagined. As she continued to sort through the papers, she started to piece together a disturbing pattern. These were not just random victims, they were part of a larger network, spanning multiple states and even countries. The more Corey read, the more it became clear that her father's business was not just about pawn deals, but also a front for something far more sinister. The pawn shop, once a symbol of family tradition, was now revealed to be a cover for human trafficking. The files detailed the movements of people. The names Corey could never have imagined were now linked to her father's world. It was as if Rick had been orchestrating the entire operation from the shadows, using his business as a means to launder money and cover up the traces. Corey felt her heart race. How could this be? How could Rick, the man she had known and admired her whole life, be involved in something so disgusting? It seemed impossible. Not only were there names and addresses, but the way these documents had been hidden from the world was just as alarming. They were meticulously organized and secret, as if Rick had gone to great lengths to keep them out of sight. Corey could feel the anger rising within her, but also fear. What had she discovered? How far had this gone? Was Rick the only one involved, or were there others? These were questions Corey didn't want to answer. His face showed it, but he knew he could no longer ignore it as he delved deeper into the files. He found more evidence of Rick's involvement in the human trafficking ring, names of individuals who were caught, transported, and sometimes even sold. The documents contained dates and specific locations where the victims were taken, all under the guise of legitimate transactions. It was chilling to think that the pawn shop, where customers had trusted the Harrison family for decades, had been used as a front for a criminal organization. The weight of this discovery hit Corey like a ton of bricks. His whole world seemed to crumble around him. Everything he thought he knew about his father and his family was now in question. Rick wasn't just the man he had proudly called his father. He was now implicated in something much darker, part of a network that had destroyed lives, a part of a system that had been hiding right in front of his eyes for years. Corey knew he couldn't ignore this discovery. The truth had been presented to him, and there was no turning back. The evidence was undeniable. It wasn't just a few scattered documents. It was a well-organized operation, carefully planned and executed by Rick. The pawn shop where he had built his empire was actually a hiding place for something much more dangerous. But the question remained. What was Corey supposed to do with this information? How could he expose the man who had raised him, the man he had admired his whole life? It would ruin the Harrison name forever. The pain of all this was almost unbearable, but deep down, Corey knew he had no other choice. He couldn't live with the truth that these crimes had been committed under his roof and in the name of his father. He couldn't pretend everything was normal when the truth was so clear in front of him. With a heavy heart and a mind full of questions, Corey made the decision that would change everything. The next step was clear. He had to take these documents. He had to make the world know the things his father had hidden. It was the only way to stop the vicious cycle that protected the victims whose lives had been ruined by Rick's actions. But even as he made that decision, a feeling of fear still lingered inside him. What would happen to the family? What would happen to the empire? And most importantly, what would happen to his relationship with Rick? These were the haunting questions he faced as he prepared to take the first steps into the world of truth, betrayal, and justice. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think Corey is making the right choice? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to follow this story as it unfolds. The moment Corey Harrison decided to bring the files to the FBI, his entire life changed. He was unprepared for what he was about to discover when he entered the mansion that night. The documents had been hidden in a compartment beneath the floor, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover them. But the truth always finds its way out, whether we are ready or not. And Corey Harrison was far from ready when things took a serious turn. Corey had to face a truth that was both heartbreaking and soul-crushing. The father he once knew, the man who raised him and taught him how to run the pawnshop business, was no longer the man he had trusted. Rick Harrison, the beloved star of Pawn Stars, was the center of a human trafficking ring. A network of exploitation, manipulation, and violence had been operating under the guise of a legitimate business for years. This discovery not only shattered Corey's image of his father, but also broke his sense of identity, family, and everything he had known. The emotional impact of this realization was beyond words. For years, Corey had admired Rick, admired his negotiation skills, his strength in building an empire from scratch, and his guidance in navigating the complexities of life and business. As a child, Corey always saw his father as a mentor, protector, and authority figure. Their relationship was one of respect and admiration. Corey often played the role of a model for his own son in many ways, spending years living in Rick's shadow, learning from him, understanding his methods, and trying to make him proud. But now, as Corey sat in front of the damning evidence, all of that was in question. His world was slowly collapsing, and he felt powerless to stop it. The love and trust he had for his father had been replaced with a deep, burning sense of betrayal. Rick, the man he had always told him that family was everything, had built his success on lies. The foundation of their relationship had been destroyed by deception. And the man Corey called his father was, at worst, a criminal, and at best, a man who had turned a blind eye to the suffering of countless individuals for profit. As Corey sat there, his hands still trembling in shock from his discovery, he was faced with a decision no child should have to make. How could he do this? Exposing her father as the monster he had become. How could she accuse the man who raised her, the man who taught her everything about the business they had shared for so many years? Rick wasn't just a father to Corey. He was a mentor. Someone she had always been able to trust for advice, wisdom, and protection. But now, all of that had been tarnished by the horrifying truth Corey had discovered. Her entire perception of her father was shattered, and along with it came an overwhelming feeling of confusion and pain. The days that followed were an emotional whirlwind as Corey tried to process the weight of this discovery. He lost many sleepless nights, tossing and turning in bed, replaying everything that had happened. The moment he opened the drawer, a chilling wave swept over him as he read through the files, and the questions kept swirling in his mind. Why would his father do this? How could someone who seemed so loving and invested in the success of his family be involved in such depravity? The questions were endless, and each answer seemed to lead to even more uncertainty. In the long hours of doubt and despair, Corey found himself looking inward, not only questioning his father's actions, but also his own role in all of this. Corey had missed the signs, had been so wrapped up in the business and the fame that he hadn't seen the dark truth lurking beneath the surface. These questions gnawed at him, making it impossible to focus on anything else. He felt betrayed, not just by his father, but by himself. How could he have been so blind? How could he have been part of a system that allowed such horrors to continue? As Corey wrestled with these emotions, he began to distance himself from his family. His once strong and meaningful relationship with his father had become strained and irreparable. Corey found it increasingly difficult to face Rick. Every conversation reminded him of the man his father had become, the man who had concealed a terrible secret for so long. And every time Corey looked at Rick, he no longer saw the father who had raised him, but a man who had betrayed not just his family, but countless innocent lives. The pain of knowing the truth was suffocating. Corey just wanted to go back to the time when everything was simple, when his biggest concern was learning the ins and outs of the family business and making Rick proud. But now, with the revelation of his father's involvement in a massive criminal enterprise, everything had changed forever. That dream seemed impossible. Corey felt trapped in a nightmare with no easy way out. She couldn't pretend everything was fine. She couldn't ignore the victim files or the undeniable truth that her father had been living a double life. As Corey struggled to cope with the emotional weight of her discovery, she found solace in those who supported her. A few individuals who knew Rick's dark side but had stayed silent for many years. These allies, though few and far between, became Corey's only source of comfort and understanding. They, too, had been victims of Rick's manipulation, and they understood the pain of betrayal. But even with the support of these people, Corey had to face a harsh reality. Exposing her father's crimes would cost her everything. Her relationship with Rick would be irreparably damaged. Her position in the family business, once seemingly secure, was now uncertain, and the media scrutiny would be relentless. The world that once admired the Harrison family would now turn its back on them, questioning everything they had built. Corey knew that by exposing the truth, she was signing her own relationship's death sentence with her father and her public life. However, despite the enormous emotional loss, Corey knew there was no turning back. She had to do the right thing. The burden of the victim's suffering, the pain and devastation they endured, mattered more than ever before. The bond Corey once shared with Rick led him to make a promise to himself that he would never support the exploitation of others, even if it meant severing ties with the family he had grown up in. In the weeks that followed, Corey threw himself into the investigation with absolute focus as he worked with the FBI to uncover all of Rick's crimes. He began to feel a sense of purpose, a reason to keep going, despite the emotional chaos that seemed to always haunt him. But even as the investigation progressed and more information came to light, Corey couldn't escape the haunting pain. The pain of losing his father, not due to death, but because of the truth he would carry with him forever. There were moments when Corey wanted to give up, wondering if he had made the right decision. But then, He thought of the victims who had suffered at Rick's hands, and the decision became clear once more. He had to move forward. He had to be the one to expose the truth, no matter the cost. Corey's emotional journey was not only about exposing his father's crimes, but also about finding the strength to do what was right, even if the ultimate price was greater than he could bear. Not only had his father concealed the truth, but Corey was also avoiding the painful reality that the man he loved and trusted was capable of unimaginable deeds. But as always, the truth had a way of revealing itself and reaching Corey's heart. He knew that despite the pain, he had made the right decision. The man he had once admired was no longer there. Instead, there was the truth. And it was that painful, harsh truth that freed him and the victims of his father's crimes. Corey Harrison never imagined the path he was about to take would lead him to expose the man who had been like a father to him all his life. As Corey dug deeper into the archive, the extent of his father's concealment became clearer than ever. Clearer and more alarming by the day, Rick Harrison, the face of Pawn Stars, the beloved reality TV star, had lived a double life, one that Corey could no longer ignore. And while it broke her heart, Corey knew the public needed to know the truth. The pawn shop had always been Rick's pride and joy, the foundation of his public image, the base for his fame, where strangers came with their treasures, hoping to strike a deal with the witty patriarch of the family. The pawn shop on TV portrayed Rick as a shrewd businessman, a man who built his empire through hard work and a keen eye for valuable items. He was the epitome of success, the man who achieved the American dream. But the truth Corey uncovered painted a much darker picture. As she examined the documents in the hidden compartment beneath the estate, she realized that the pawn shop was not a beacon of honesty and fair dealings, but a front for a vast human trafficking network. This shocking discovery was something Corey could never have prepared for. It wasn't just a small crime lurking in the shadows, but a large-scale operation that had been going on for years, right under the noses of the public, the police, and even those closest to Rick. The more Corey examined the files, the more it became clear how deeply her father was involved. It wasn't just about human trafficking. It was about a carefully constructed network using the pawn shop as a cover for money laundering, victim trafficking, and creating an exploitative system that stretched across borders. Rick Harrison, with all his charm and business savvy, is accused of orchestrating this from behind the scenes, manipulating the business he made famous to serve a much darker purpose. At first, Corey couldn't believe the man she grew up with, the man who taught her everything about the business, could be behind such evil activities. But as the evidence mounted, the truth became undeniable. Corey's hands trembled as she continued to read through the files. Names, dates, and locations. The documents exposed the full extent of Rick's involvement in the trafficking ring. This operation was vast, spanning from Nevada to other states and even across the globe. Victims were transported across the country, hiding in plain sight. Their fates had been sealed. Rick's involvement in the underground world made everything seem darker than ever before. The pawn shop, once a symbol of honest commerce, now stood as a hollow facade behind Cena. It had once been the center of illegal activities. Corey couldn't help but wonder how long this had been going on. Had she unknowingly helped with these actions? Maybe she had accidentally aided her father in hiding this ring simply because she was part of the family business. As she came to this realization, Corey's thoughts shifted to the victims. The names in the files weren't just numbers or statistics. They were real people with real lives, real stories, and real suffering. The files painted a grim picture of how these victims were manipulated, coerced into situations they couldn't control. Some were taken from their homes, others were sold into the ring by family or friends. The human traffickers, including Rick, had used the pawn shop as a way to transport them across the country. Hiding them in plain sight, the pawn shop, once a place where people came to sell their belongings, had become the dark hub of criminal activity. Corey couldn't understand how her father could separate these two worlds, the public image of a successful businessman and the private reality of a man who had betrayed everything he had stood for. It was clear that Rick had built his empire on lies, using the pawn shop as a cover to hide the true nature of his activities. But even more concerning was the realization that Rick had managed to manipulate his entire family, including Corey, into becoming a part of the operation, whether they knew it or not. For years, Corey had worked alongside her father and trusted him completely. They had shared stories, business advice, and dreams for the future, but now, after this revelation, it all seemed like a lie. Her relationship with her father had always been built on trust, but that trust had been shattered beyond repair. Corey couldn't help but feel furious and betrayed. How could her father have kept this secret for so long? How could Rick hide something so horrific in plain sight while maintaining his image as a successful and beloved businessman on TV? As Corey continued to investigate the depth of Rick's involvement in the human trafficking ring, she began to uncover more disturbing details. Rick had been part of a much larger criminal network. Working with powerful figures in the underground world, the human trafficking network wasn't confined to pawn shops. It was a well-oiled machine. A ring that spanned several states, involved numerous accomplices, and had been operating for years without detection. The files contained detailed information about the locations where victims were held, the dates they were taken, and the people responsible for transporting them. The pawn shop had been used as a clearinghouse, a place where victims were moved from one location to another, their fates decided by the whims of the criminals controlling them. The scale of this operation was staggering, and Corey realized this was much bigger than just his father. Rick was just one link in a much larger machine, a machine that had exploited people for profit. For weeks, Corey pored over the files, trying to understand everything he had uncovered. The evidence was undeniable, and the more he investigated, the more repulsed he became. Rick had used his business as a cover, hiding behind the success of the pawn shop to facilitate one of the most insidious crimes in history. Corey felt as though the ground beneath his feet had been ripped apart. The life he had built, shaped under his father's guidance, had been based on a spiritual foundation. The emotional weight of this discovery was almost unbearable for Corey. How could he have been so blind? How could he have trusted so much? He had been fully immersed in his father's world without seeing what Rick had been doing behind the scenes. Corey's sense of guilt and shame was overwhelming. He wondered if he had played any part in the operation, if his actions had unknowingly helped cover up the truth. The feeling of betrayal was deep. not just because of what his father had done, but because of the role Corey had unknowingly played in the facade. But despite wanting to avoid the truth, Corey knew he couldn't. He had to expose what Rick had done, no matter the cost. The victims of the human trafficking ring had suffered for far too long, and Corey couldn't let his father's actions go unpunished. The world needed to know what Rick Harrison had been hiding for all these years. He owed the victims, and he owed it to the truth. The dark side of Rick Harrison's empire had been exposed, and with it came the collapse of everything Corey had once known: the pawn shop, the family business, and his public image. Rick Harrison, it was all a lie. But the truth has finally been revealed, and there is no turning back. Corey knows this is just the beginning of a long and painful journey. The consequences of exposing her father's crimes will be enormous, but it is a journey she has no choice but to undertake because of the gravity of this discovery. Corey realizes that what she uncovered has become much more complicated as she exposes her father, Rick Harrison, and the criminal network connected to the pawn shop. This is not a simple matter. Corey knows that although the truth has been laid out, it is now time for the authorities to take control. However, she also understands that the investigation will be delicate and dangerous. What she discovered is not just a betrayal of her family, but also the key to unraveling a large-scale criminal operation that extends far beyond the walls of the pawn shop. Corey's decision to hand over the documents to the FBI is the first step, but the real work is still ahead. The human trafficking ring hiding in plain sight is barely just beginning. It has been operating for many years, with its reach spanning across national and international borders. The scale of this operation is truly staggering, and the more Corey shares with the FBI, the more they realize just how deep this conspiracy runs. The first meeting with the FBI was tense. This is only the beginning of a dangerous investigation, with the truth continuing to unfold. This story isn't over. Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. What do you think about the scale of this operation? Will Corey be able to complete this investigation and bring the truth to light? Don't forget to leave a comment with the number 1 if you sympathize with Rick Harrison, or 0 if you have a different opinion. Share your thoughts because we've got even more shocking revelations waiting for you. See you in the next videos.